10 years ago, the Russo-Ukrainian War started. 2 years ago, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. In this documentary, I will explain the over century of history that has led us to this point. I will tell you about different events and use images from the time to show you. My goal is to educate you about this conflict and how it's more important than just Russia invading Ukraine. I will talk about the hardships of the Russian Empire, how brothers from another mother had to fight side by side in World War One, and then against each other in the Russian Civil War. I will talk about the dictatorial Soviet regime, the Holodomor terror famine, and World War II, the transfer of Crimea and the collapse of the communist state. I will talk about post-Soviet conflicts and Ukraine's dabble with nuclear weapons. I will talk about the rise of Vladimir Putin. Finally, I will talk about the current conflict with the invasion and annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. After the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, Japan had influence over the Korean Empire, and it was clashing with Russia, who had influence over Manchuria in northeastern China. Many of Russia's ports were frozen for a lot of the year. Russia's port of Vladivostok was the best it had, with it being usable in the summer but still frozen in the winter. To get around this major problem, Russia made a deal with the Qing dynasty in 1897 to use Port Arthur in the Liaodong province of China. Seeing Russia as a rival, Japan offered to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for recognition of the Korean Empire as being within the Japanese sphere of influence. Russia refused and demanded the establishment of a neutral buffer zone between Russia and Japan in Korea north of the 39th parallel. The Imperial Japanese government perceived this as obstructing their plans for expansion into mainland Asia and chose to go to war. After the negotiations broke down in 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy opened hostilities in a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur on the 9th of February 1904. The Russian Empire responded by declaring war on Japan. Russia lost the war, an embarrassment. This loss was one of the factors that caused the 1905 Russian Revolution. What time is it? That's right, it's time for a revolution! After many years of authoritarian rule, the Russian people had enough. It didn't help when a priest and many civilians were killed in cold blood during a peaceful protest. This basically went like this. Hi, I'm a peacefully protesting priest with my peacefully protesting people. We have a letter for the Tsar for changes we think should happen peacefully. Thank you. Allow us to repay your kindness and peace with bullets. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, along with this tragedy, was the straw that broke the camel's back, with a revolution breaking out across the Russian Empire. With worker strikes and military mutinies, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to enact reform. These reforms kept the Tsar and his family in power, however it wasn't enough, and the 1905 revolution set the stage for later 1917 revolutions. World War I. Dead archdukes, war declaring, armies mobilizing. There were multiple fronts, and one of them was the Eastern Front between Germany and Austria-Hungary against Russia. At the start of the war, the Russians were doing well. Until they weren't. With defeats like the Battle of Tannenberg, the front got pushed back and back until they were on the brink of collapse. In 1915, Tsar Nicholas II fired Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, who was in charge of the war and took control of the front, and it probably went a little something like this. We need a new general. Why don't we put a competent veteran who knows what he's doing in charge? How about me? We're doomed. In 1916, the Germans attacked the French city of Verdun. The French put out a call for help. On the Western Front, this call was answered by Britain, who started the Battle of the Somme. On the Eastern Front, this call was answered by Russia, who started the Brusilov offensive, which was one of, if not the greatest offensive of the war. It was a massive Entente victory, but at a great loss of life. Supplies ran out and the offensive stalled, achieving its goal of halting the German advance in Verdun and forcing Germany to contribute massive forces to the east. The success of the advance caused Romania to join the war, and they got wrecked. The great loss of life, including the lack of supplies for both soldiers and civilians, begun the 1917 revolutions, which would change Russia forever. What time is it? That's right, it's time for another revolution! In the February Revolution, the Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne and a provisional government was set up. The problem was the provisional government kept Russia in World War I, as well as sharing power with the Petrograd Soviet. This delicate balance of power would only need one radical man to topple the government. The Germans realised this, and they decided to send Vladimir Lenin, a Russian communist who was exiled to Switzerland, to Russia on a train in April 1917, hoping that he would cause chaos and pull Russia out of the war, allowing troops of the Central Powers to reinforce the Western Front. And cause chaos he did. What time is it? That's right, it's time for another revolution again. In the October Revolution, Lenin took control of the country and made it communist, starting the Russian Civil War between the Red Bolshevik Army and the White Anti-Communist Party. This started a domino effect that eventually led to the creation of multiple communist states in the world. Lenin did what the Germans and Russian people wanted him to and pulled Russia out of the war. This wouldn't have changed much though, since it was 1918 and the United States of America already joined the conflict. After the 1917 Russian revolutions, many countries became independent. One of these was Ukraine. The Ukrainians were in a dire situation as the Red Army invaded the country to bring it under Soviet control. The Ukrainians were losing the war and needed outside help. The Europeans heard their call, but it wasn't the Western powers you'd assume. It was in fact the Central Powers who came to Ukraine's side. In exchange for supplies like Ukrainian wheat to combat Britain's maritime blockade, the German and Austro-Hungarian empires would provide military assistance to Ukraine against the Bolshevik Red Army. When this agreement was reached, 450,000 German and Austro-Hungarian troops crossed the border into Ukraine, forcing the Soviets out. Lenin then recognized Ukrainian independence. This was until the end of the First World War, when the Germans left. The Soviets then invaded again and took Kyiv, and proclaimed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Ukrainian SSR. Poland was also there because they wanted to retake Polish lands that Russia took from them many years earlier. It's 1924 and Lenin has caught a case of the deads, and he was replaced by this man, Joseph Stalin. What a sexy moustache. If you thought Lenin was bad, well, you ain't seen nothing yet. The Holodomor, or Terror Famine, was an event in the Soviet Union in 1932 to 1933. For some context, you must know that Lenin gave the peasants land, and now Stalin was taking it back from them. They resisted, and many were sent to the labour camps. Due to this, a famine happened, and the Soviets, when asked about it, responded with, "Famine? What famine?" Stalin also kept exporting wheat and food because it paid for the Soviet industry. However, many Ukrainians fled to Poland and spread news about the famine. The famine affected the whole of the USSR, but it mostly affected the south. By the end of the famine, the death toll was as high as 8 million, with Ukraine particularly losing 3 million people to the famine. With the famine being affected largely by the government, many consider it a genocide, and it's mostly remembered as a Ukrainian tragedy. The year is 1941, and an angry man with a silly moustache tried to take over the Soviet Union and punch the Soviets to Moscow. Then, the Soviets, with help of their good ally, the Winter, punched the Germans right back to Berlin. This war was known as the Eastern Front, or to the Soviets as the Great Patriotic War. This war would see Russians and Ukrainians come together to fight a greater enemy, but this would only last so long. The war eventually ended, and tensions between the two would soon rise again. It's 1953, and Stalin remembered that he was mortal, and fucking died. He was replaced by this guy, Georgy Melenkov, who resigned 6 months later, and he was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. The thing about Khrushchev is that he followed the trend of previous Soviet leaders before him, and that was not being Russian. He was in fact Ukrainian. We don't know why he did the transfer, whether it's for his love for Ukraine or if it was practical due to Crimea being connected to Ukraine and not Russia. For whatever reason he did it for, Nikita Khrushchev decided to transfer Crimea from the Russian SFSR to the Ukrainian SSR on the 19th of February 1954. Let's skip a few years. It's 1989 and the Soviet Union just pulled out of the 10-year-long war in Afghanistan. At this point in time, years of economic troubles, competition with the West, and failure in war caused the start of a collapse. In 1989, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet equivalent to NATO, collapsed and the communist governments there failed. In 1990, East and West Germany united, demolishing the East and the communist government there. Also in 1990, Lithuania declared independence from the Soviet Union. This created a domino effect until Ukraine declared independence on the 24th of August 1991, ending communist rule in the country. Fun fact about the leader at the time, who was Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the only Soviet leader to have been born in the USSR. Everyone else was born in the Russian Empire. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine found itself the third largest nuclear power in the world. Ukraine had 1,900 Soviet strategic nuclear warheads and between 2,650 and 4,200 Soviet tactical nuclear weapons deployed on its territory at the time of independence. This was a problem, as both of the superpowers were disarming their nukes, and if Ukraine kept them, then the Soviet nuclear disarmament wouldn't happen. This was a big problem, and that couldn't be solved for many years. Ukraine did have the nukes on their soil, but the ability to launch them was in Moscow, making it hard to do so. Ukraine would have to create an entire nuclear program from scratch, and right after the collapse of the USSR, that wasn't an option, politically or economically. The 1994 Budapest Memorandum saw the US, the UK and Russia all agree that the borders of Ukraine looked as they did, and that none of the powers involved would try to change these borders either militarily or politically. This was done in exchange for Ukraine giving its nukes to Russia. However, this promise was later broken. During the time of the Soviet Union, Putin was a KGB agent. Once the USSR collapsed, he went into politics, becoming good friends with Russian President Boris Yeltsin in order to gain power. He had large involvements in the two Chechen wars, gaining power and public support. In 1999, Putin became Prime Minister of Russia, and Yeltsin wanted him as his successor. On the 31st of December 1999, Yeltsin, who was unpopular by this point, resigned as president, announcing Putin as acting president until the 2000 elections, which he won. After winning the 2000 elections, Putin served 2 terms until 2008, where he was replaced by Dmitry Medvedev, as he was ineligible to serve again. During this time, he was Prime Minister again. However, in the 2012 elections, Putin became president again, and has so far served for 2 6-year terms. In 2020, Putin passed a law that basically wiped the slate clean for both him and Medvedev. He did this as a Russian president can only serve for 2 consecutive terms. This means that Putin can be president until 2036, where he'll be 84 years old. If he lives that long, that's another 12 years in office.